Hello, everyone. Welcome to the 5th episode of The Greats of History, the podcast where we get to know people with the epithet of the Great and try to get past the honorific and understand who they were, what they did, and why some people seem to like them so much. Last time, we got to know what happened to Egypt after the death of their great warrior king Thutmose III, the chaos and controversy of the reign of the heretic Akhenaten, the collapse of the 18th dynasty, and with it, the brief and somewhat inconsequential rule of the boy king Tutankhamun, and finally, the rise of a new dynasty determined to get the Egyptian empire back on track. All this buildup got us right to the birth of a boy destined to be pharaoh, and to contend with Thutmose III for title as greatest ruler in Egypt's long history, Ramesses II. But at the time he was born, such a future would have been impossible to predict. You see, at his birth, Ramses was neither a member of the royal family nor a part of the succession. He was born during the reign of Horemheb, the general who ascended to be pharaoh after the death of Tutankhamun and his successor, Ai, and who embarked upon all of the methodical efforts to erase Akhenaten and his family from history. This means that when Ramses II was born, he had no family ties to the new ruler. But Horemheb had died without a son, and he named his vizier, the boy's grandfather, Ramses I as successor. This meant that all of a sudden, the 11-year-old Ramses was a prince, an honest-to-God prince. It didn't take long for him to begin an apprenticeship. As it had happened with many successful leaders, the older generation took care to prepare the young prince for power. Ramses I died after just a couple years and was succeeded by Seti I. One of Seti's first acts as successor was to name his son, Ramses II, as heir apparent. But he needed more than a title. It was the military that had forged Egypt's empire under the great pharaohs of the 18th dynasty. It was the military that had restored Egypt's pride after that dynasty's spectacular collapse. It was to the military that Ramses went for his training. As far as campaigns go, Egypt had plenty on the to-do list. In addition to the usual squabbles with the Hittites to the north and the Nubians to the south, Egypt had a new foe to deal with. For all of its long history, and remember, as long ago as all this was, we are still in the time period called the New Kingdom. Egypt had benefited from its geography, with western deserts providing a blanket of security. The hot, arid regions tended to insulate Egypt from threats to its west. But increasingly, brazen nomads began raiding and plundering, sneaking into Egypt, not by coming around the desert, but through it. The Libyans, it would seem, were not just a problem for Doc Brown. As the Libyans stepped up their incursions, the pharaohs and commanders of Egypt had to think west, in addition to north and south. Defending the empire became that much harder, and required that much more skill and organization. The military would be stretched to account for many trouble spots, and Ramses was busy putting out fires. And while he and the Egyptian army had plenty of threats to deal with, Ramses was gaining invaluable experience that would come in handy when he was the guy in charge. And that moment came sooner than expected. About 10 years after having been appointed as heir apparent, Seti I died unexpectedly, approximately age 44 years of age. Father and son may have served as co-rulers for a brief time at the end of Seti's life, but regardless, when his father died, Ramses II acceded to sole rule. He was about 24 years old. Like many of the leaders we've discussed so far, once newly installed in office, Ramses would be put to the test right away. When thinking about Egypt, it's easy to remember the sacred Nile, but we shouldn't overlook that other great body of water that was also instrumental in forging the kingdom, the Mediterranean. The Great Sea to the north was vital for trade, and moving armies here and there was both important for the security and the prosperity of the kingdom. Around the time of Ramses' accession, a group of pirates called the Sherdon had been growing bold in the raids on Egyptian shipping. Today, little is known who these mysterious sea-going raiders were. But you may be pleased to know that unlike the Vikings, these pirates seem to actually have had horned helmets. While details about their origins or ethnicity today are scant, their attacks on Egyptian shipping were causing serious problems for the empire and for its new pharaoh. This disruption was straining the Egyptian economy and threatening to have diplomatic consequences too. Adversaries were always probing for Egyptian weakness, and the Sherdon were revealing one to the world. Their aggressions might give other geopolitical adversaries some ideas. The pirates had to be dealt with. With all the energy that comes with being in his early 20s, and eager to prove himself, Ramses resolved to end the menace. He got right to work. He didn't want to address the problem piecemeal, taking on one pirate ship at a time. Rather, as befitting his energy and ambition, Ramses resolved to eliminate the threat to his kingdom in one fell swoop. But tracking down pirate ships in open seas can be difficult. Cornering a pirate navy all at once, near impossible. Ramses struck on a brilliant strategy. The Sheridan had been operating with free license, and Ramses understood that they had been growing bolder and bolder. He decided to use this aggression against them. His first step was to deploy his navy, not out in open seas, but hidden in coves and harbors near key shipping ports. He then sent his merchant fleet out unprotected, tempting the Sheridan with a big, juicy prize. As they sailed off, Ramses baited his hook. Sure enough, the Sheridan pounced upon the Egyptian fleet. Following their orders, the Egyptian ships made a beeline for their home harbors. Hot in pursuit, and unable to resist so tempting a prize, the pirates came crashing after their targets. Ramses had lured them into an ambush. Once the Sheridan ships were contained inside a manageable area, the Egyptian navy sprung its trap, swarming out from behind their hiding places and swinging behind their adversaries with overwhelming force. The Egyptian navy trapped the Sheridan against the shore, and in short order, the pirates were crushed, their ships smashed to pieces, and many of the troublesome pirates taken captive. Ramses had not only survived this early test of his leadership, but also solved a thorny process for his kingdom to boot. In the process, he showed a clever mind that relied not just on brute martial power, but also on cunning strategy. But a rabble of pirates was one thing. But how would Ramses respond to a challenge from another great martial empire? He was soon to find out, because, once again, a change in leadership had emboldened an enemy. The Hittites, whom we first met in our episodes on Thutmose III, were aggressively expansionist. With a young king on the Egyptian throne and big plans for their empire, conflict was inevitable. Ramses' dad had fought the Hittites over the key border city of Kadesh. While Seti had won the day, the Hittites had waited until the winds shifted and simply resumed control while the Egyptians weren't looking. This provocation couldn't slide. The city was too important. You may recall in the last episode, I said that Kadesh was something of an obsession for Egypt. With it back in Hittite hands, the young pharaoh needed to take it back, and in the process prove to any would-be aggressors that he and Egypt were not to be messed with. Like his great conquering predecessor, Thutmose III, in the fourth year of his reign, Ramses organized a lightning march to the north to confront his arrogant neighbor. Kadesh lay in the Levant, just into the modern border of Syria from Lebanon, about 60 miles from the Mediterranean coast. Situated on the Orontes River, possessing Kadesh was geographically important to both rival kingdoms. The city was a gateway to the interior of Western Asia, and thus the lands and trade networks on the Tigris and Euphrates. It was also close enough to the coast that depending on who controlled it, Kadesh could either protect or hinder naval operations. For their part, possessing Kadesh was imperative for the Hittites. It blocked the northern approach into their empire and was a bulwark against Egyptian aggression. Lose Kadesh to Egypt and, in theory, Ramses could go on to threaten the entire Hittite homeland. There was a lot at stake. The Hittites were unimpressed with Egyptian aggression and confident in their growing power. Just as Thutmose III was bent on breaking the Mitanni to his will, Ramses seemed determined to dominate the Hittites. Ramses closed the roughly 1,000-mile distance from Egypt to the contested territory with breathtaking speed. Just 30 days. This alone demonstrated profound logistical and organizational talent. Ramses' armies were organized into 4 main divisions and various other units. The Navy supported the effort from the sea, bringing equipment and supplies up the coast in support of their terrestrial brethren. Of note, the vanquished Sheridan pirates had gone from foe to friend, or at least friends for hire. Needing all available manpower and recognizing their prowess for navigating the open waters of the Mediterranean, Ramses formed a partnership with the vanquished Sheridan, striking a deal to enter them into the service of the pharaoh. As Ramses made the march toward Kadesh and toward his showdown with the Hittites and their king, Muwattili II, they encountered a pair of Bedouin nomads who had key intelligence on the location and the strength of the enemy. Muwattili, they revealed, was near the key city of Aleppo, about 125 miles away. Ramses' speed and organization had brought him to his objective so fast that he had taken the enemy by surprise. Ramses was tickled. His lightning march had won him a key strategic advantage, the element of surprise. Seeking to capitalize on his good fortune, Ramses ordered his divisions to fan out, set up camp, and scout the best approach to attack Kadesh. He would pounce as soon as the best plan could be determined. With his enemy so far off, he had the luxury of going over everything, drawing up his plan of attack, pouncing on Kadesh on his terms, in his way. His goal was tantalizingly close. The army spread out and encamped according to his orders. He fell right into a carefully laid trap. The key intel that Ramses had gathered about Muwattili's location? A lie! A sneaky Bedouin. They'd been planted to give Ramses false information, and he had fallen for it. Hook, line, and sinker. The Hittites were actually just a mile away. They must have been elated when they saw Ramses let his guard down and spread his troops out. Before Ramses could get wise to his error, the Hittites closed the scant distance with the Egyptians at frenzy speed. Before Ramses knew what hit him, Muwattili's army attacked in force with their elite chariot and cavalry units. The surge of Hittite troops crashed against the unprepared Egyptians. The opening phase of the Battle of Kadesh was off to a horrible start for Ramses. Matters were complicated by the fact that his army was stretched out over miles, his divisions spread out and uncoordinated. The Hittites could concentrate their attack on subsets of the Egyptians without having to face the entire combined weight of their army. Estimates vary on the number of belligerents, but the estimates of 15,000 Hittites against 20,000 or so Egyptians seems reasonable. Egypt seems to have had a slight numerical advantage, but the Hittites had the element of surprise and all the momentum. What little advantage the Egyptians had in numbers was more than offset by the fact that they were scattered all over the place, their forces diffused over a wide area, and they were caught completely off guard. Way back in the introductory episode, I shared that I think the very specific accounts of battlefield tactics and troop movements and the like can get a little tedious and distract from the bigger picture. And besides, in this case, the specifics are ultimately unknowable, and with huge doses of conjecture filling in the massive gaps between little isolated details. So, here is the most important battle of Ramses the Great's career, in a few short sentences. After being overrun, the Egyptian army was in panic. The Hittites concentrated their forces on Ramses' personal division, hoping to kill or capture the pharaoh and knock out their foe in one epic death punch. The Hittites surrounded Ramses' camp, and he and his elite corps of bodyguard troops made a desperate stand. Ramses himself was in the thick of the fighting, or so he would claim, bravely fending off each Hittite incursion. Meanwhile, the other divisions got their butts in gear and marched quick-time harch. I love quick-time harch. As they arrived, the tide of battle began to shift. With greater force and fresher troops, the Egyptians drove the Hittites away from the pharaoh and toward the Orontes River. Slowly but surely, the Egyptians turned the tide of battle. At the end of the day, the Battle of Kadesh, which pitted the two most powerful forces of the Near East and their respective kings against one another, was a draw. But a battlefield stalemate was a strategic win for the Hittites, as it held their southern border firm. Ramses was now in a very tough position. His army was sapped of its strength, exhausted from its lightning march north, and then its desperate fight for survival. Ramses had failed to achieve his key strategic objective, and was overextended, far from the safety of his kingdom. Rather than own up to the blunder that had put his army in such peril, Ramses did what any good leader would do. He made excuses and he blamed other people. In particular, he singled out what he perceived to be as the cowardice of some of his men. Ramses decided to make an example, publicly executing his own troops as a warning to others. Next time, Pharaoh expects you to fight harder. Having cowed his own troops, if not his enemy, Ramses did a U-turn and started a long march south. They headed home with much less enthusiasm than they left. He was followed closely by the Hittites, who used the sudden weakness of the Egyptians to pry even more territory away from their enemy. They kept their distance, but stayed close enough to prevent Ramses from reversing his tracks and renewing his campaign. Ramses limped back to Egypt, humbled by his hard-fought tie and his near-death experience. It really made him think. Oh, who are we kidding? There is nothing humble about this guy. Rather than give a truthful account of a tough contest against a worthy foe, Ramses announced a great victory, a smashing victory, a total victory. The story he told his subjects was that the enemy was humiliated and Egypt was dominant. And who was the hero of this epic victory? Why, Ramses himself, of course. The pharaoh described himself as solely fending off the savage enemy, personally slaying countless Hittites, and setting the example of courage that would inspire the army to rally. It was his bravery that had won the day, his courage that rallied the troops, his greatness that the Egypts were so blessed to have. What happened mattered little. It's what he said that happened that mattered. And given the fact that he had executed his own troops in the aftermath, there weren't exactly a lot of people waiting in line to tell the true story. The people back home certainly had no way of knowing the outcome. If Ramses said Kadesh was a big victory, then it was a big victory. That became the accepted narrative, and it passed down through the generations. For years, and by years I mean thousands of years, it was accepted that Ramses had truly won a great victory at Kadesh. This was the accepted historical narrative. He made such a big deal about it, carving grand inscriptions that exalted himself in victory. With only his side of the story to go on, there wasn't anything to indicate to the contrary. But do you remember a little while back when I mentioned that the Hittites were a lost and found empire from the pages of history? Part of this discovery was volumes and volumes of official records of their diplomatic correspondence with foreign kingdoms. These records were found in their ruined cities. In addition to being expansionist and aggressive, the Hittites were also inveterate note-takers. The only challenge to scholars is that even once this treasure trove of ancient records was discovered, no one knew how to read them. It wasn't until the 1930s, more than a century after historians and archaeologists began to unravel the mystery of the lost Hittite civilization, that these priceless artifacts could be decoded and interpreted. When they were, the stories that they told made scholars sit up and take notice. These records offered scholars a new way to look at old narratives, and the Hittite communications told a very different tale about Kadesh and the relationships between the Hittites and the Egyptians. Their accounts of the showdown with the Egyptian rivals painted a very different tale indeed. This inspired scholars to look anew at Ramses' inscriptions and reconcile the accounts. An altogether different picture slowly emerged about what really happened at Kadesh. The accepted narrative shifted from a wholesale acceptance of Ramses' smashing victory story to the more nuanced tale told a moment ago. In his proclamations and inscriptions, Ramses definitely didn't tell the whole truth and nothing but the truth. But that hardly mattered, because the ability to claim the victory was almost as important as the victory itself. And as long as the pharaoh told his people he'd won a great contest and they believed him, or at least didn't contradict him, then what difference did it make? Now, to be fair to Ramses, he didn't exactly live in an age when kings and queens were portrayed as flawed or even fully human. These were god kings. They were expected to be perfect and powerful. Ramses was just following the conventions of his time. Still, it's noteworthy to point out that the victory he so loudly claimed, and the battle that historians counted in the win column for millennia, was anything but. This is the battle on which he built his reputation. Thus his reputation was founded on a shaky foundation, even if it took people thousands of years to see the cracks. Still, braggart though he was, Ramses was no fool. He could see that his great task was to keep his Asian holdings in line and to keep a watchful eye on those troublesome Hittites, with whom he continued to battle periodically in the years following Kadesh. He needed to realign his kingdom's axis of power to fit this new geopolitical objective, and he needed to be closer to his enemies, better prepared to respond to any provocation at a moment's notice. The kingdom's HQ was down in Thebes, closer to the cataracts in the Nile than the river delta. This location was steeped in tradition, grand monuments and temples and palace complexes, but it was just too far away from the northern-oriented power axis. It was time to move his capital. But which city should he choose? Which could match the splendor and glory of the great pharaoh? Well, none, of course. True to form, Ramses chose instead to build a new capital from the ground up, near the north of his kingdom and much closer to the Hittites. Marshaling the considerable resources that marked him as probably the richest man in the world, Ramses ordered laborers, architects, and artisans to get to work. Money was no object, but time and the pharaoh's patience were short. The city sprang up from the Nile Delta, with grand temples, cooling lakes and pools, shaded gardens, and luxurious palaces. Unlike Thutmose III, who only seemed happy marching at the head of his army, Ramses definitely enjoyed the trappings of divine royalty. Of course, the city was loaded with the most important feature of any grand new capital city: monumental statues of the pharaoh himself. He was everywhere. Inscriptions, statues, temples. Ramses made sure that his grand new capital overawed visitors with its splendor. And then time and time again, reminded them to which magnificent god-king it was all dedicated, himself. And what would Ramses name his new capital? Well, Ramses, of course. Or to be precise, Pyrames, the House of Ramses. Just like the ego of its namesake, the city quickly grew to outsized proportions. Estimates put its peak population at about 300,000, which might have been as much as 10% of the entire kingdom. Vanity project? Sure. Geopolitically savvy? Definitely. Like many Ramesseid projects, Pyrames served multiple purposes. Art and architecture rivaled the lofty heights of Amenhotep the Magnificent. Quite an accomplishment. This even while shifting Egyptian power north, closer to its colonies and foes alike. And if there was trouble down south, the prevailing winds of the Nile kept Kush within arm's reach. Pyrames reinvigorated Egypt's cultural output. The fact that it served to cement the cult of the pharaoh was a bonus. Or it was the main reason, and all the other stuff was a bonus. Either way, there it was. Not all of Ramses' projects were so vainglorious. The Libyans, that troublesome group crashing through the western wastelands to wreak havoc on the kingdom, continued to be problematic. Previous pharaohs had neglected the security of the western kingdom, but previous pharaohs had never had to deal with incursions across the desert such as these. There was no template for how to deal with this threat. Ramses, in what was becoming a pattern, didn't respond piecemeal, but rather looked for an all-at-once, holistic solution. As such, Ramses ordered construction of an extensive defensive system. He built and populated border towns to ensure greater vigilance near the fringes of the kingdom. He added to these a string of defensive fortifications along the western edge of the Nile Delta to keep the threat at bay. Some of these constructions were formidable. For example, the fortress town of Zawiyat el Rakam hunkered behind walls 16 feet thick and more than 30 feet high. The Libyans, accustomed to lightning raids unchecked back and forth across the desert, found their paths blocked with cities and walls, and beside them, decidedly unamused soldiers. Following the execution of his ambitious defensive plan, Ramses quieted the western frontier, subduing the Libyans, and proving to the people that he was quite capable of keeping them safe, thank you very much. It was a massive undertaking, but it succeeded. With this accomplished, he could renew his focus not just on defense, but on the quest for foreign expansion. Ramses projected his power everywhere, in all directions, all at once. North against the Hittites, west against the Libyans, out at sea against the pirates, and south against the Cushites. Ramses used his grand projects as a way not only of reminding his people of his divine glory, but also of projecting his omnipotent image at the margins and to remind would-be belligerents that it would be foolhardy to run afoul of him. For example, to ensure that the Cushites down south would behave, Ramses commissioned a massive temple complex at the second cataract of the Nile, at a place called Abu Simbel. This served to remind those far removed from the capital that the might of Egypt and that of Ramses stretched far indeed. Building such a grand monument right at Kushite doorstep was a kind of highway billboard advertisement. One of the key themes of his sculptural program at Abu Simbel was his smashing victory at Kadesh. All these years later, Ramses was still shouting about his epic win. Over protest much? Given how often he kept talking about Kadesh, we will too. Let's revisit this initial setback for a moment. In reality, I should be a bit fairer to Ramses. His first major campaign had mixed results, but there were also parts of the Kadesh campaign that are to his immense credit. The logistics required to organize, provision, and move his large army about 1,000 miles away in just a month was itself a remarkable accomplishment of leadership. Had he not been duped by the false informants, his victory would have likely been achieved. After all, even after he had been caught napping, and with his forces scattered, he managed to rally the troops, organize a counteroffensive, and drive the Hittites from the field. He didn't lose the battle, it's just that his propaganda claims make us look a bit askance at it. And after Kadesh, Ramses showed that he learned his lessons well. He parlayed this experience into accomplishments he didn't need to embellish. In his eventful and extremely long reign, Ramses took to the field a lot. Not quite as often as Thutmose III, but more than most. The Kadesh campaign was just one. Ramses marched his armies to battle on another dozen or so campaigns, and after his initial stalemate, Ramses found his footing. He never again tasted defeat. His armies were honed to razor-sharp precision. Battle after battle, war after war, Ramses shook off the torpor of his original struggle to go on a serious, undefeated streak. After Thutmose, many scholars consider Ramses to be the greatest warrior king in Egypt's history. He was 12-0-1. He definitely had numerous successes, but they weren't all on the battlefield. Despite his puffery, Ramses was a political pragmatist. Perhaps chastened by Kadesh, he understood the Hittites were here to stay. While each were powerful, neither empire was quite strong enough to invade or conquer the other. For better or worse, they needed to coexist. Roughly 2 decades into his reign, Ramses concluded a peace treaty with his sparring partner, turning, at least on paper, or papyrus, foe into friend. After Kadesh, the two sides had fought intermittently, with neither gaining the upper hand and both suffering the associated depletion of resources and manpower. For 16 years, the two empires had gone toe to toe. Rather than keeping the interminable war going, Ramses and his counterpart, the Hittite king Hattusili III, put aside their differences. They struck an agreement, forming not just an alliance, but hammering out an elaborate deal, enacting a complex treaty between the two powers. One thing that's noteworthy about this treaty is that we know so much about it. Ramses, and by now I'm sure you'll be shocked to hear this, proclaimed this as a great triumph. Historians knew that the treaty existed, and that Ramses bragged about it as another example of his greatness, but the actual wording of the treaty seemed lost until it was rediscovered in 1828, or at least the Egyptian version was. Remember a little while ago when I mentioned the rediscovery of the Hittites included much of their imperial archives? Well, the Hittite version of the same treaty was uncovered in 1906 and was part of the rediscovery of the lost Hittite civilization. Once translated, this find complemented the Egyptian version of the treaty. It makes the Egyptian-Hittite treaty the oldest in history for which we have both sides. In this accord, both empires agreed to eschew attempts to conquer or evade the other. But remarkably, they also pledged mutual defense, with each promising to come to the defense of the other in the advent of invasion by any other belligerent. They also agree not to harbor fugitives of the other, among other niceties. Ramses authorized the treaty for Egypt. Hattusili, the son of Muwattili, did the same for the Hittites. To seal the deal, Hattusili sent his daughter south to be one of Ramses' wives. When she died a few years later, another Hittite princess was sent to marry the illustrious pharaoh. So, he was a prolific builder, a logistical master, a great conqueror, well, aside from Kadesh, a gifted propagandist, and an accomplished diplomat. Arts and architecture thrived in his rule, and he kept the empire safe and secure from violence on its borders. He was also adaptable. Even though he didn't actually admit to any mistakes, he seemed to have learned from the ones he made. Sounds pretty great. What else did he do? Well, I'll tell you. He lived, and then he kept on living. Ramses must have started to actually believe he was immortal. He lived past 90, by one account, to 96. This is at a time and an age when most men didn't live to be 40. He lived more than twice the life expectancy of men his age. Even accounting for all the care and attention he received as a god king, this is a remarkably long life. And by living for so long, his reputation benefited. The wealth of Egypt was, first and foremost, derived from the agricultural productivity of the fertile Nile floodplain. During Ramses' long life, bumper crop followed bumper crop. He was quite fortunate to benefit from the unique combination of great harvests and long life. The crops just kept growing, and the money poured in. The people were happy and well fed, and the pharaoh could pour all the resources he wanted back into building, or arts, or sculpture, or whatever. Long life plus good crops equals legacy. A legacy that resounded through the millennia. Of course, all this would have come to nothing without some genuine skill in leadership. Plenty of rulers have squandered great resources or alienated so many people that no amount of cash or crops in the world could win people over. Ramses seemed to be a unique combination of talent and ego. He had both in spades. We remember him as great because he told us he was great. But maybe he told us he was great because, he was great. But no matter what he might have said or truly felt, he was not, after all, immortal. Ramses II, after a reign of 66 years, finally crossed over into the afterlife. His son and successor, Merneptah, finally became pharaoh in or around 1213 BCE. He didn't have the same limitless energy as his father, but in his defense, he was an old man at the time of his accession, probably about 70. Again, the life expectancy for an Egyptian man in the New Kingdom was less than 40. The death of Ramses marked the end of the high water mark of Egyptian power and glory. Some of his successors were talented, Others barely register in the historical record. But all had to face a reality. From here on out, and despite the occasional uptick here and there, the trend line was clear. Egypt was in decline. No one had ever achieved the lofty heights of Ramses II. So what's to make of this guy? Was he, great? Well, one thing to consider is why he was called as such. One simple reason for calling him the Great was to differentiate himself from all the other Ramses, of which there were 11 in total, spanning across the 19th and 20th dynasties. The final pharaoh to bear the name was Ramses XI, the end of whose reign ended not only the 20th dynasty, but also the entire New Kingdom period in Egyptian history, where we started all the way back in part 1 of the Thutmose III episode. We can debate if Ramses II was great in general, but it's pretty clear that he was the greatest of all the Ramses, and given how many of these guys were and how rich and powerful Egypt was, certainly that counts for something, right? It seems that a big part of his legacy was how dedicated he was to promulgating his image and screaming from the rooftops of all of his illustrious deeds, both real and contrived. I mean, the guy had so many statues and inscriptions made. There's not a single city from the period without some kind of monument to Ramses II. Not content with commissioning new carvings and statuary, Ramses also appropriated monuments from prior pharaohs and had them recarved in his image. Further still, he was sure to have his name carved into every single ancient monument in the kingdom. This guy, he wanted his name and likeness everywhere and on everything. Statues, temples, carvings, imperial decrees. Ramses amped up pharaonic propaganda to a new height. You get the sense that if he had a good hair day, he'd commission an imperial decree to let all corners of the kingdom to say, "Oh my God, come and see how good he looked." Egyptologists, so I read once, actually get quite sick of seeing him all the time. Another thing to mention about Ramses is his kids. He had a few. Well, a dozen. Well, dozens of dozens. Well, something like 100. The exact number isn't known, but it's not less than 80 and could be as many as 162. He had so many kids that when one considers all the time invested in activities that lead to all those kids, it makes you wonder if he had time left for anything else. Ramses had so many kids and lived so long that something like a dozen sons and thus potential successors predeceased him. By the time he finally kicked it, aged 91 or so, his successor was 70. This wasn't exactly an age of crazy long life expectancy. Recall earlier in the episode when I said that Ramses was about 24 when he came to the throne, and that his successor, the 13th oldest son, was about 21 years younger than his comically prolific dad. Put those together and you'll deduce that Ramses must have had nearly 24 kids before he even became pharaoh. By the time his 13th son was born, Ramses was still 3 years away from getting the big job. Specific numbers and dates for ancient history are notoriously hard to nail down, but even if these are off by a year here or a kid or two there, early and often was, apparently, one of his unofficial mottos. Ramses did more than have kids. He also married them. 4 of his daughters, to be precise. Ramses had 8 wives, and fully half of them were his own daughters. To be sure, part of this was ceremonial, keeping the royal family all in the, family. But it does appear that he may have had a child with at least one of his daughters. Now, I have to confess, I got the shivers when I first typed that line. Incest marriages were a staple of Egyptian dynastic rule, but more often than not, this was half-brother and sister, not father-daughter. I mean, both are offensive to modern sensibilities. We can't know if the father-daughter thing creeped people out back in the day. If it did, it wouldn't have mattered to him much, because it's not like Ramses was exactly tolerant of critique. In keeping with the conventions of the day, in addition to his wives, Ramses had concubines for his sexual pleasure. In true Ramesseid form, he took this to extremes as well. Over his rule, it is estimated that Ramses had 200 concubines. Goodness, maybe this guy earned the name the Great on stamina alone. Another question to consider is the biblical book of Exodus. There have been a lot of suggestions that Ramses is the pharaoh it references. This theory is supported by a clear textual reference to Pir Ramesse. While it's an alluring idea, it's far from proven, and recent scholarship suggests that the events depicted in Exodus, whatever their historicity, happened much later than Ramses' lifetime, by several centuries, and unlike Amarna, the new capital built by the heretic Akhenaten we discussed in part 1 of this episode, Pir Ramesses was a success, a thriving city that endured long after its eponymous founder finally died. So any depiction of the power and glory of Pharaoh and the subsequent pharaonic indecision that let Moses lead his people out of captivity seems best chalked up to someone else further down the historical timeline. In our first 2 episodes, I personally felt that our subjects, Sargon of Akkad and Thutmose III, were on balance pretty great. This one, I'm not so sure. Every time I convince myself that he is great, something comes up to argue the counterpoint. His over-the-top vanity, his almost pathological need to procreate, his embellishment of his campaigns. But every time I decide he's not, I remember the heights of prosperity, the resurgence of the arts, his vigorous and effective diplomacy, his track record in warfare, the general peace and stability of the empire, including solving the dual problems of pirates on the seas and raiders across the desert. And so then I think, maybe he was. I guess it depends on how you define great. One way to look at greatness is simply standing out above your peers. And this Ramses did, and by a considerable margin. Given the chronology of Egyptian history, there's more than enough room for several people to have earned the epithet of the Great. I have to remember to simply not compare Ramses to, say, Thutmose III, but also to the nearly 200 or so other known pharaohs in the 3,000-year history of the dynastic period. And even in that exalted company, Ramses does indeed stand out. Of course, he had a lot longer to add to his resume than the average ruler. The good news for us is that we aren't necessarily here to judge whether people have earned their epithet as much as it is to explore people to whom it has been given. What's great about history is that you get to decide for yourself. You can't visit his tomb in the Valley of the Kings, as it has been damaged by repeated floods and is deemed unsafe. The tomb, given the archaeological designation of KV7, has lost much of its inscriptions and adornments due to these floods. There's a bit of an irony that the pharaoh who put his image on everything has suffered from the loss of the capstone, the epitaph, the summaries of an extraordinary life meant to pave his way to the afterlife. We will have to rely on, well, all the other stuff for Ramses to tell us his story. Incidentally, the guy had so many kids that his own tomb was insufficient to house them all. Just a few doors down, so to speak, is the sprawling tomb of KV5. Keep in mind, these tombs are carved into the rock. The bigger they are, the deeper they go down into the earth. KV5 was used for Ramses' sons and possibly daughters, so that they can enjoy a nice resting place for their own journeys to join the gods in heavenly pursuits. In particular, it seems that the tomb was first established as the place of interment for the sons that predeceased Ramses. KV5 is the largest tomb in the Valley of the Kings. So far, about 150 rooms, each carved from the bedrock, have been uncovered, and excavations have been going on continuously for almost 30 years. Based on the layout, it seems there is yet more to discover. The tomb may have more than 200 rooms. Ramses II, it would seem, is still holding on to a few secrets. Like so many pharaohs, both great and minor, the mummy of Ramses II was plundered in antiquity and joined that big pile of corpses called the royal cache discussed in the Thutmose III episode. But even long after his death, Ramses wasn't quite done doing unusual things. Once his mummy had been identified, scholars sought to return him to his tomb. But in the mid-1970s, Egyptologists were horrified to discover that the mummy was rapidly deteriorating. They rushed Ramses off to a lab in France for conservation. In order to make sure there were no issues in the transit, Egypt even issued Ramses a passport and listed his occupation as king, deceased. To mark their respect for the great pharaoh, the French authorities greeted him with a full military escort and top diplomatic honors. Among other things, the careful examination of Ramses revealed that he was about 5'7", and even, despite his great age at the time of his death, had a considerable head of hair. Today he's got a new home. His mummy is in the National Museum of Egyptian Civilization in Cairo. Ask him yourself if you think he was great. But if we know anything about Ramses II, then I think we already know what he will say. Thank you for listening to this episode. I am grateful that you did. Join us on the next one when we get to know the ruler who might just be the greatest king to hail from that city that sits in the popular imagination of power, temptation, and decadence. Babylon.